to the second edition of the screencast for EDU 242, 342, or 552 for fall 2014. This is my way of showing you an example for Project 2. So to start this project, there are a couple things that you're going to need to have up. One is your lesson plan template, which you copied in the last class. The other thing that you'll want to have up is Weebly. So make sure that you have your Weebly up and make sure that you have your lesson plan template up. One of the other things that I think will also be helpful as you are working on your lesson plan is this link right here that takes you to some, it's a page about Bloom's taxonomy. And on this page, as you scroll down the page a little bit, you're going to see a lot of examples of different levels of Bloom's taxonomy and different verbs to use in your objectives. So everything from compares and contrast to analyze, explain, describe, identify, all sorts of various levels of learning and evaluation and assessment that you can use in your objectives, which is an important part of your lesson plan. So before you get started, I'm actually just going to clear off a couple of windows back here. One of the things I want you to do is go to your Weebly page or Weebly site and then click on Pages. And then I'm going to have you add a new page. So for the last project, you created a digital portfolio. One of the things I'm going to have you do is add another page to your site. And I'm just going to add a standard page. I always like to go with the no header page. And then let's call this Project 2. And then the second thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bring this up and I'm going to put it here. Now, one of the things that you can do when you have pages is you can actually kind of nest pages, and you do that by pulling it to the right like that. Well, I'm actually going to pull it and put it here so that it's under the digital portfolio. And then I'm going to go down here and I'm going to click Save and Edit, and it will take me right to sort of a clean page to use for my site. So this is only a small component of Project 2, but it is an important one because you're going to post all of your materials that you'll use for the lesson right here. So I'm going to go back to my lesson plan, and first thing I'm going to do is kind of identify the class. I'm going to be doing a 7th grade civics lesson. And actually this is a 7th grade here. So it's civics in 7th grade. Now, my unit objective, I'm actually going to pull from my actual lesson plans from a lesson or a unit that I kind of just started this week. We sort of just wrapped up sort of a review over sort of the other branches of government. We're really delving into the judicial branch. So one of the things that I want students to be able to do is analyze Supreme Court cases and describe how they have impacted U.S. history. So if you flip over to those Blooms, those are going to be some of those slightly higher level objectives. There's the analyzes, breakdowns, and that's kind of what I'm having my students do. I want them to get to sort of a deeper level, and those unit objectives are usually going to be a deeper level. So we want to kind of have a long-term goal that after a long range of lessons, they will be able to meet that goal. So in the prior lesson, I will start there, and in the prior lesson, if I flip over to my lesson, again, for the prior lesson, I just need a quick description of kind of what you've done the lesson or two prior to the lesson that you'll be teaching. And so what my students have done at the beginning of this unit is they picked a Supreme Court justice, and then they kind of found some information about them, and then the following day they presented about that Supreme Court justice, and then they actually got to play a little game on iCivics to kind of practice that. So right here, I would just put that students created presentations they then presented them to the class and we discussed them. This was followed by some time to play Supreme Decision on iCivics. So there, in sort of a couple sentences, I've described what we did in sort of the previous lessons, and that's kind of leading us into the current lesson. So the current lesson, the objective for this one is that students will be able to describe significant Supreme Court cases throughout history. So, in this particular lesson, we are going to examine 3 specific cases. And so I might even refine this objective a little bit more and say students will be able to describe 3 significant Supreme Court cases. I might just change that up to be in history. So I make this a little bit more refined. Now I want to go to my activities. And my activities are really pretty simple in my lesson plan. My first one is that we are going to look at a slide, read a short description of Marbury versus Madison. And that is only going to take about, I'm going to actually say about 5 to 10 minutes. I'll just say 5 minutes there. Now, this particular activity, one of the things I want you to do is I do want you to kind of color code. This is fairly much a teacher-led activity. I'll have the students kind of, read it out loud, but I'll kind of help them break it down and understand it a little better. So I'm just going to be kind of telling them a little about that. So I want to color code that. So I'm going to go up here, go to highlight, and I'm going to color code that as a blue activity. My second activity that I'm going to do here is I'm going to have them do a follow along of slides, and they actually had the option. They got to draw along, or they got to kind of write their own description of what they saw on the slides. And that was for the Dred Scott decision. So draw along or captions for the Dred Scott slides. This was somewhat of a hybrid teacher-led and student-driven activity because the students were very active. They had to draw or write captions for the slides. So they weren't just sitting there listening to me or just taking random notes. There was some kind of student input as to what they had to do with that. So I'm actually going to code that as a green activity. And that particular activity took a little bit longer. That one was probably about a 10-minute activity. And then my third activity, going over to here, is that the students were then going to create slides. First I gave them a couple of websites, and we actually read. So I'm actually kind of going to jump in. I'm going to divide the third activity into kind of 2 activities as we whole class reading of summary of Plessy v. Ferguson. So that gave students a little background on Plessy versus Ferguson, and then that led into the last activity, where they were going to create slides to describe details of the Plessy v. Ferguson case. And so that is going to help meet my objective, kind of like the final component of meeting the objectives, that they'll be able to describe 3 significant Supreme Court cases in history. So again, I'm going to code this one. This one is pretty much a teacher-led as we kind of read through it, or I guess it's somewhat student-led, but I'll call it teacher-led. And then the last one is really very much a green one. Now, in this particular lesson, I don't have anything in the purple, so they weren't working in pairs or groups or peer editing, but they do have a fairly significant chunk of time, because this one only took about 5 minutes, and then the rest of the class, for about 30 minutes, they got to work on their slides for creating that. So the majority of the class time is student-driven, and that's one of the things that I want you to have on this, is that the majority of your class time should be these greens and purples. You should limit your teacher-led time as much as you can. And so then my ultimate assessment is sort of the activity 4 is the slides telling the story of Plessy v. Ferguson. All right, and then in the following lesson, we are actually going to have students present. Students will present, or select students will present some of their presentations, present their slides. Then I guess I could say next we will watch a video on Brown versus the board. Okay. This will lead into a discussion of other cases. Okay, so there have been a lot of Supreme Court cases, and the students ultimately, as a final project, will choose a Supreme Court case from history and do kind of a larger project on that Supreme Court case. So overall, my prior lesson is written up here. My post lesson is here, so we can kind of see the scope and sequence. And then here's my basic lesson for this. So I've got my lesson plan completed there fairly easily. The next part then is I need to add the components to my website. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click share here, and I'm going to grab a shareable link because I want to put my lesson plan, a link to my lesson plan, on my web page. So I copy that link, I go to Weebly, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to put in a text box here. And then on that text box, I will just say, this would be my lesson plan for Supreme Court Civics unit. Right? Make that just a little bit bigger there. And then I'm going to click my link button, and paste in my link for that. So now I've got my lesson plan in there. Now, I'm going to go back to the rubric over here. Here's the rubric. So I've got a clear measurable goal for the lesson. I've got a unit goal laid out. I've got a description post, pre and post. I've got each lesson of my activity described. I've got the time and the type of activity. And now my next part is any links to worksheets, templates, or rubrics you have. And so this is where, right here, one of the things I probably want to add to my lesson plan is a link to this. So this is one of the things where I showed students where we read about Marbury versus Madison, and then we had all these slides and so forth. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to put that in my lesson plan. So I'm going to grab a shareable link for that. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to put that back into my lesson plan here. And I will just kind of put that right here. Actually, I can just kind of put it down at the bottom, I guess, because it kind of goes with all those things. Unhighlight the green for that there. All right, so there's kind of the links to the activities that we'll be using. And then also over here, one of the things it says is an assessment that is clearly linked with the lesson objective. And so my assessment here, I will probably need to do a little bit more with it later, but the slides telling the story of Plessy versus Ferguson, the students will clearly describe, in this case, 1, but then they had to do the draw-alongs in their notebook, so that was 2. And then the third case, they actually had to write a short description of that after I kind of discussed it with them. So they really have covered all that in the assessment. So I'm not going to do it now, but this is something I might want to expand a little bit on in terms of how I'm going to assess all 3 Supreme Court cases. But moving back to the website, I will go here. I've got my link to my activities, or the lesson plans here. I also am going to put an actual link to this presentation. I'm actually going to embed this presentation. So I'm going to go to File, Publish to the Web. I'm going to go to Embed. And I'm going to move this to, I'm going to put this on probably, I'll go to Custom, and I'll just make it a 400 here. And then I'm going to copy this embed code. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to grab an embed block. And I'm going to put this right to the right there. Okay. So I can plunk this in there. Center it. All good. Okay, so I need to move that over just a smidgen. I'm actually going to make it a little bit more there. Okay. And one of the things I find that if you have to move blocks like this and kind of move things over, press the shift button when you're moving, and it tends to move a lot better. So there right now, if I'm looking at the rubric for Project 2, one of the things you'll see here is we have a separate page for our website that's going to host all the components. I've got a link to the lesson plans, and then I want examples of student activities or links or descriptions. So right here on my website, this is one of the things I'm going to be using to teach. And these are the slides that go through Marbury versus Madison. There's the reading. There's the slides we went through for Dred Scott. And then at the end, there's a couple of websites that the students could get started with regard to Plessy versus Ferguson. One more thing I want to add, and this is kind of an important thing that a lot of people leave out on Project 2, is I really want to see an example of student activities and kind of what it's going to look like. So since my students actually did this today, I'm going to grab one of those student samples, and I'm going to grab, let's just grab like Javon's here, and let's see what he did. And then I can just go ahead and I'm going to embed his onto this website so that we have an actual student sample. Now you guys don't have students necessarily, so you may want to create one for yourself of what like a student sample would look like, so students can kind of get an idea of what that's going to look like. And here are Javon, like he's got 5s. I said they had to have 4 to 6 slides today of the situation. So now here he talks about the Separate Car Act. He's talking about who Homer Plessy was. He talks about how he was arrested, and then he talks about the court case. So I would eventually, I'll eventually evaluate this, and we will, we'll give him a grade on that. So right now, I'm just going to add that to my website. Again, I'm going to make that a custom and make that about 400. So this is the student product that came out of the. Oh, I got to click publish here first. Project or the lesson that we did today. So I can see that, through his project and what level of understanding of the Plessy case that he did. So he can see that took cases to 2 courts. He lost both cases. He took it to the Supreme Court, and he lost it at the Supreme Court. And he's got the main idea of who Homer Plessy was. He's got the idea about the train. He knows about the Separate Car Act. He calls it the Separation Car Act. So then I can just go ahead and grab another one of those embed blocks, and I'm going to stick it under here. And I will paste in that. And one thing I might add to this, just so it's a little bit clear, is a quick little text box or title that says, like right here, that this is the in class right here. So this would be right here. This would be the teacher-led portion. Some of that. Teacher-led portion. Make that color just a little bit better there. Okay. And I'm also going to center that. Okay. And then on this one, I'm going to call this the student sample. So just so it's very clear what's going on the website, that we've got a teacher-led portion over at the student sample. And then if I wanted to make this web page, I'm not really worried about your web page being perfect in terms of the layout and design. That's not really one of the things that I'm assessing for this particular project. But what I do, am really looking for is that you have all the different things that you're going to be using in your lesson. So here I've got my lesson plan. Here's the teacher-led portion. Here's the student sample. I don't have like a particular rubric that I have created for this, but in terms of grading these Plessy versus Ferguson slides, but that would be another great thing to include on this to really get full points, because anything that you're going to assess, you really want to assess clearly, and I don't have that currently right now for this particular project ready to go, but that's something that you could kind of put over here on the left side. Is sort of like maybe even just a very simple rubric of how you are going to grade this project, so I can kind of see what that looks like. So then the last thing that you would have to do is write your reflection. And then your reflection is, again, just sort of a 300 to 500 word essay. And this is where, in this section right here, where you're going to describe, obviously I haven't done too much description in activities, and the reflection is where I really want you to describe in greater detail how you see the lesson functioning and running. And this is where you might tell, for instance, on my activity 2 here. In my activity 2, one of the things that I did in class is, actually I could even say that we started off, we read the slide about Marbury versus Madison. I talked about it a little bit more, and then I told them that the highlighted part was sort of the most important part about this case, that the Supreme Court struck down, it was the first time that the Supreme Court struck down a law, called it unconstitutional. And then so that was kind of like the activity 1. And then activity 2, we went through all these slides, and this is where students had to write a caption for the slide or describe in their own words what was going on. And I went through these 6 slides, and I said, this is kind of a model for what I want you to do on your project, because on your project, we first read the first summary, and then if they needed more information, they could go to this summary. And that was how what the resources that they used to make their own slides, which I showed you. Here's one student sample here. So that's what I would do in the reflection, is you just give kind of in greater detail what you're doing on this. And then lastly, you're going to talk about why is this student-centric. To me, this was student-centric because the students spent the majority of their class time creating the project and reading it for themselves and figuring out how they were going to present it. And then how does the assessment measure the goal? That's another thing that I would write about and talk about, you know, how this particular project is student-driven, and it's clearly identifying and describing what happened in a particular court case. And then what are some possible problems that could go wrong with this? Well, one of the things that I anticipated going into this was that students would probably have a little bit of trouble reading some of the information about Plessy versus Ferguson, and that's why I tried to stem that by giving them some specific websites to go to. And the PBS one in particular, I felt was maybe a little challenging for some students. So that's why I also gave them the street law one, which was sort of just a very simple paragraph overview of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. I thought that was kind of a good place to start. And then for those who wanted to add a little bit more and get a little more information, I provided this one. So that was one of the ways that I tried to address any problems that could have happened for some of the reading or for some of the investigating that may have been too challenging, some of the readings that might have been too challenging for students. And then lastly, these are just some subjective measures, and this is really dependent upon your lesson. Are they age appropriate, and are they sort of creative or novel in terms of their grouping or the technology integration? And then is their hands-on time? Is it clearly something that students you know, are working and not just sitting and listening to you? So one other thing that in terms of my technology integration for this that I didn't mention above is that all I did at the beginning is I didn't have a projector at all for this lesson. Obviously all my students had screens, so this particular slideshow that you see up, I just shared it to them in a views folder that I have. And so you can kind of see here, there's the students who I shared it to. And they just had to pull it up on their screens, and I'd be like, okay, everybody on slide 2. And then I'd say, all right, slide 3, slide 4. And then I just kind of talk about it, and they could see it on their screens. And if they needed to go back or forward on something, they could do that at their own pace. So they had this shared with them the whole time and could always kind of rip through whatever they needed to go through. So in a nutshell, that is project 2. And please review it if you have any other questions. That's all. Bye.